Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Happy Christmas. So it seems slightly difficult to say that without sounding vaguely like I'm taking the mick, unfortunately, but I hope you're all as well and as safe as possibly can be in a pretty trying time. Now, it is done. 4.5 years after Britain voted to leave the European Union with that infamous 52 to 48 margin, the hardest possible Brexit has just been signed off between the European Union and the British government. Now, as you can see, and I'm sorry to spoil your Christmas, I think we've got a picture of Boris Johnson. There he is. The deal is done. So at least he's happy. So, I mean, if you were already on a downer, this is probably not what you wanted to see as soon as you logged in. Now, but while much of the British media are wrapping themselves in the flag right now, they'll march loyally. We'll see this, I think, with several newspaper front pages tomorrow, as though it's some grand Christmas miracle for the Conservatives. I'll be joined today with two brilliant experts to unpick what the deal actually means in a country, of course, torn by the biggest crisis since World War II and one of the biggest peacetime calamities in modern history. Now, just some basic housekeeping. Firstly, if you're not already subscribed, go to the YouTube main page, press subscribe. Not just subscribe, but you can press the bell thing, and that will give you notifications. So you'll always get a notification when the videos are happening, which is handy. On Patreon, thank you so much for everyone who's supporting this, so I can actually pay for people on a union wage to get this video channel up and running. We've just started it, of course. It's doing so well because of your support. We're doing some great documentaries. We've got some great interviews coming up, ranging from Michael Sheen, for example, to Judith Butler, the brilliant feminist philosopher. So there's a whole range of videos coming up. We're doing some documentaries next year as the pandemic permits. So if you go to Patreon/OwenJones84, any support is always appreciated. Another thing, on 27th of December at 1 o'clock, I'm doing a special fundraiser, 1 p.m. on the channel, in support of the campaign against living miserably. They're an anti-suicide charity. The biggest killer of men in Britain under 45 is suicide. We know mental distress has only been exacerbated by the horrors of the pandemic. And I'm doing it with a whole just incredible range of comedians and celebrities. It's going to be really fun, actually. We're all going to probably have a drink. I'm going to be asking them about their happiest moments, their proudest moments of 2020 and what they're hoping for in the year ahead. And finally, if you want to support this channel, but also put some questions forward, use super chats. If you go on the live chat, the $sign at the bottom, you can either put up a comment, which will flash up on the screen, or flash up one of your questions if you want me to put a question to the panelists, or a super sticker, and I'll read out at the end of the show to say thank you to everyone who supported us. Now, the disclaimer there, if you just pay to abuse people, then obviously we won't, but we'll still take your money. Before I bring in the guests, a lot of the media have spent the last few days claiming talks were on the precipice. This was high drama, no deal's going to happen, etc. Now they grabbed from the the very last moment this incredible deal, or a deal at least. They've hyped up no deal. That was not where I was at, and I hate to be that guy. And I'm not. This is not a time for anyone to be smug. Look at the country. But 11 days ago, this is what I tweeted. Let's have a look at what I tweeted. On the 13th, let's see if a bad deal was always going to be agreed between Boris Johnson and the EU. No deal was deliberately hyped up, and now most of the British media dutifully cheer a great victory snatched in the nick of time. We shall see. I'm not feeling overly optimistic about large sections of the media. Now, let's look at how the government are spinning this. Now, this is what they sent out to members of the press lobby. If we just flash that up on the screen. Oh, it's not up here. Oh, here it is. There we go. Yeah, so this is saying that the promises during the 2016 referendum and the general election have been delivered by this deal. We've taken back control of our money, borders, laws, trade. The deal's fantastic news for families. Rah, rah, rah. It's the biggest bilateral trade agreement side by either side, covering trade worth that amount of billions of pounds by 2019. So that's what the spin coming out of the British government. The EU, on the other hand, have released a document which is, as one British journalist put it, pour encourager les autres. It's to try and deter other people from doing this. Now, they've done a checklist. That's the first page. There's a second page as well. And it goes through all the benefits Britain has now lost. Now it's outside of the European Union. Now, Robert Peston is I'm actually very critical of a lot of the media, how they've treated this whole process. Let's start with a good question, though. This was, I thought, quite an important question I'm going to put to the panelists shortly. And it was put by ITV's Robert Peston to Boris Johnson at his press conference earlier.
What you've agreed means that we in the UK have to follow EU rules on subsidies, on tax, on workers' rights, on the environment, or potentially incur the imposition of tariffs. That's right, isn't it? I mean, we've just heard Ursula von der Leyen say that she got her level playing field, which you explicitly rejected all the way through. You also just said there would be no non-tariff barriers. Again, that's not right. From January the 1st, as a result of leaving the customs union, and Michael Gove has been warning about this week in, week out for months, there is a ton of new bureaucracy on British businesses. Lots
Now, where are Labour going to do? Where are Labour at on this? Now, Keir Starmer did an impromptu press conference or address to the nation. Let's see a little clip from what he said.
At a moment of such national significance, it is just not credible for Labour to be on the sidelines. And that's why I can say today that when this deal comes before Parliament, Labour will accept it and vote for it.
Now, I'm going to be a bit cheeky here and say that's a political calculation by Labour. If Labour don't vote for the deal, then it will still pass. There isn't the Tory rebels to stop that from happening. Obviously, they have a whopping big majority. I know a lot of people say, what about the ultra-Brexiteers? They took over the Conservative Party. And it's a political calculation based on winning over Leave voters. And that's a legitimate political choice, I would argue. Some maybe not, but it is a legitimate political argument. But it was the same political calculation that tortured Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. Now, there's a lot to unpack, a huge amount, but I've got the best possible guests to go through with me. Now, I'm going to bring in first, let's bring in Jonathan Portes, Professor Jonathan Portes at King's College London, a brilliant economist who's done a behind the main architects of a report looking at the economic impact of this Brexit deal. Hello.
Good evening, Owen. How are you?
Very as well as we can hope. How would you rate 2020 so far?
Well, it's there's only one direction it can go in. More seriously, it has been obviously a dreadful year for the country and in many respects for large parts of the world. I am hopeful things will get better. My 80-year-old mother was vaccinated last week, which was a good note to end the year on, and I sincerely hope that I and you and everybody else who's watching this will be vaccinated relatively early in the new year. And I genuinely believe, actually, that in that sense, both from a social and an economic point of view, things will start to get quite at least by spring of next year. Things will genuinely start to get better. I don't want to sound like Boris Johnson saying, oh, it'll all be over by Easter, but actually I do believe that round about Easter, we will feel much better about how we are living. And that really is very important to all of us, not just to economists.
And it's a really important point. And we'll actually talk about in the final part of the program, looking forward and how this intermingles with the pandemic and the economic fallout of the pandemic. Let's bring on our other fantastic guest. Let's bring in John Liss. Now, John, by the way, just so we're all clear, because we have two Jonathans, which is a huge, one of the many problems that we have to deal with in the show. But we've already resolved this particular one, unlike the calamity facing Britain. So we're going to call Jonathan Liss will be John. Basically, it's who prefers being John the most. And it turns out John Liss is happier than Professor Jonathan Portes. So John is a brilliant political commentator, but also a Brexit expert. He's written some really, really fascinating pieces. Please go back and Google some of the stuff he's been writing along the way. How are you? How are you coping, John?
Well, it's not the Christmas Eve I was anticipating in lots of ways.
All right, John. You're sharing it with us. Come on.
We've had 4.5 years, and it's, this has been my life for all that time. And so it's kind of a strange feeling when you sort of reach some sort of end point. And this is, for better or worse, and I would obviously argue worse, an end point. And so the moment, it's sort of just a shock of actually seeing something in front of you and then just trying to unpick it and unpack it, and then how we deal with it going forward.
But is it the end of the beginning of the beginning of the end? Let's start with Jonathan. Let's start with a kind of pithy. I'm going to start having a pithy. We'll go into the weeds. Let's start with a pithy reaction to this deal. So let's start with you, Jonathan, as in Portes.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about who conceded what and who won. But the simple fact is this, it's not actually about winning and losing. This deal is a win-win and a lose-lose. That is to say, compared to no deal, it clearly is a win-win. Both we and the EU are better off economically than we would be with a no deal. Equally, it's a lose-lose in the sense that compared to the status quo, both the EU and the UK will be considerably worse off economically. We are introducing new barriers to our trade with Europe, which is the EU is by far our most important, largest trading partner. So in that sense, we are choosing to make ourselves worse off, and the EU has no choice but to accept that. The Europeans will be worse off as well. So there is a lot of detail here, but I think the important thing to remember is that this isn't about who won or who lost. As Monsieur Barnier said some time ago, almost by definition, there can only be losers here. The question really is the scale of the loss, and we'll come on to talk about that in a bit, no doubt.
John, what's your pithy reaction to the deal?
Just overwhelming sadness, really. This is the second worst outcome we could have expected. The worst one was obviously a no deal. But obviously we're framing it in terms of the great relief that we're not leaving with no deal. But I'm thinking about all the things we're going to lose. How for the first time, really, we have a government which is whose express overriding policy is to make people poorer, less powerful, useful in the world, to kind of to cut Britain off from its most important allies and friends and commercial partners for no gain whatsoever, for an abstract concept of sovereignty, which kind of existed in the 18th century in some way, but is not relevant to the way we live in any way. So I kind of just feel immense sadness, and obviously also for the reasons that was done, in the names of, in so many cases, in terms of nationalism, hostility to immigration, and all these things which have no business in dictating the future of our country. And so today it's a crisis avoided, I suppose. It's a damage mitigation, but it's nothing to celebrate.
Before I ask questions, if people want to use Super Chat on YouTube, I know not everyone's watching on YouTube, to put questions to the panelists, we will put them on the screen and put them to them. How did we arrive here? Let's go. I mean, some people go, do we really want to relive the trauma of the last 4.5 years? I mean, I suppose, in terms of responsibility, some would say, I mean, Theresa May, for example, the red line she set when she became Prime Minister, she set these very firm red lines, unbending. When she lost her majority, you might expect her to go, okay, look, that majority is gone. We're going to have to work with the opposition. She didn't do so until actually her administration was going into administration, as John McDonnell put it at the time in 2019. In terms of, controversy, others will talk about Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour leadership. But, I mean, just so people are aware where I came from on this, I come from a left traditionally critique of the EU, which I've written about at length. I campaigned for Remain and reform. I accepted the referendum result after my side lost, until the European elections last year, when I felt the compromise situation had collapsed. So I backed Labour's pivot as an unavoidable evil. But is it not the case as well, Theresa May, but also a lot of some of the more hardcore Remainers, they bet the house, and they didn't just lose the house, they lost the garage, the car, and the kids as well. In that, I remember writing about Norway Plus, and I'd get hardcore Remainers going, no, any Brexit's a disaster. And they toxified any alternative to a referendum. So I'm not saying, obviously, what I'm saying is Jeremy Corbyn, Theresa May, the hardcore Remainers, are they all kind of responsible for this? And that leaves me with no popularity amongst anyone. Who wants to go on that?
Well, I mean, my colleagues Anand Menon and Jill Rutter did write a piece saying exactly that, called "Who Killed Soft Brexit?" And like you, they blamed pretty much everybody from Theresa May, Jeremy Corbyn, the right wing of the Conservative Party, the hardcore Remainers who insist on having a second referendum. From my point of view, I don't know the answer to this. I think you can take two views of this. Frankly, one is that you're right, that there are everybody really messed up, and in the end, only those who wanted the hardest possible Brexit won, because everybody who didn't managed to make such a hash of it. And there is considerable truth to that. On the other hand, there is also a sort of historical inevitability point of view, which some people I know, also argue, which is that, look, there never was a soft Brexit on the table. In that any soft Brexit would have left both sides unhappy. It would have left us outside the political structure of the EU, but essentially, as a rule taker, we would still essentially have had to follow the EU's lead on most things, starting with, but not limited to, freedom of movement. And that really would, in some sense, have been the worst of all worlds. So there was never a politically viable option on the table. I think you could make that argument as well.
John, now, because you were always a more passionate Remainer, and I treated this as two friends were having this argument late night at a party, and I kind of, in the end, however this has to end, somehow just make it end so we can talk about issues that matter. What do you think? I mean, Theresa May, but also, am I being harsh on some of the more passionate Remainers?
I think you're being a little bit harsh. I mean, look, the people who are responsible for Brexit are the Brexiters. That's a fundamental truth. I mean, Remainers never wanted any of this. So I suppose that's the fundamental thing. But it's also not true that Remainers never tried to compromise. I think that's the fundamental area where I disagree with you. Because, I was part of that movement in 2016. We went to court to try and secure membership of the single market through the EEA Act. And we were denounced as enemies of democracy, as traitors, people who were Remainers when accepting the result of the referendum, even though in that referendum, people were promised everything. So Vote Leave said there's a free trade area stretching from Iceland, which is in the single market, to Turkey, which is in the customs union, and we will be part of it. Obviously, Dan Hannan famously said, no one's threatening our place in the single market. So there were plenty of people in the margins of the debate who didn't have ending free movement as their overriding priority, and who might have wanted there to be some kind of economic alignment while being outside of the EU, as Norway and Iceland are. And so it was completely wrong to ignore that point of view. And Theresa May decided, she had maximum political capital in 2016. She could have done whatever she wanted, and she chose to make ending free movement of people the overriding priority. And that was more important than safeguarding the union. So, in the end, stopping Polish plumbers was more important than the economic integrity of the UK. And that is, I'm afraid, where we are right now. So once you had ending free movement, you weren't able to cherry pick the rest. So for 2 years, we were struggling with this idea about staying in the single market and ideally the customs union as well, but kind of countering this constant attack line from Brexiters and from much of the mainstream media that people voted to end free movement of people, not recognising that people were also voting for increased prosperity, for example, which had also been promised by the Brexiters at every stage. And so that was where we were for the first 2 years, and we got nowhere. Jeremy Corbyn didn't accept any kind of single market until much later on. And so when the People's Vote was launched in April 2018, a lot of Remainers saw that was where they had to go. That now, since all the avenues of compromise have been exhausted, we had to go for the single market option, the second referendum option, rather. But it's important to note that even when we had the indicative votes in 2019, a majority of Remainers still supported that single market option. And if the single market option had won, there's no guarantee we'd have had it, because Theresa May certainly would have resigned rather than implement it. And I just don't know that the Tories would ever have allowed it to happen.
Let's talk about the deal itself today. How, during the referendum, the Leave side made some very grandiose promises, the Conservative Leavers. To what extent do you think this deal matches the promises of the referendum? Do you want to go on that, Jonathan?
Well, I think it depends which promises you look at, obviously. I mean, I think John List may disagree with this, but in some sense, in form, it does. I mean, obviously, leaving aside the straightforward lies like nobody's talking about leaving the single market from Dan Hannan or the 350 million, which were lies, and we knew there were lies at the time. But more broadly, are we going to take back controls of our money, our borders, our fish, our sovereignty, our rules, all the rest of that? In formal terms, that is what the deal delivers. Those were our red lines. That is what the deal delivers, and that is what we get. And the flip side of that is, of course, because the EU has its own red lines, that means we have to accept that we're outside the single market, outside the customs union, and there will be a lot more barriers to trade between the UK and the EU. So both sides get their red lines, and the red lines are, if taking back control and sovereignty is what you wanted in a formal legal sense is what you wanted, and you think that is what you were promised, then that is indeed what has been delivered. And so when Boris Johnson said just now that what he secured is a, quote, a Canada-style free trade agreement for the UK, unquote, that is correct. But how I would describe it is that it's actually a bit like, not so much like Canada's deal with the EU, but very much like Canada's deal with the US. So Canada's deal with the US, again, means that Canada is formally sovereign. Canada can do what it likes in some sense in terms of its borders, its money, its fish, and all the rest of it. On the other hand, of course, the relationship between Canada and the US is, despite the veneer of sovereignty, is fundamentally asymmetric. And we all know that. And we saw that when Trump got to office and tore up the NAFTA and renegotiated the Canada-US free trade deal to make it somewhat more advantageous to the US. And Canada benefits hugely from the economic relationship with the US and from NAFTA, now the USMCA. But nonetheless, but what it has is formal sovereignty, but in practice, asymmetric power over its own, over the economic relationship. And that is sort of what this deal does. We will be formally sovereign. We will have a valuable economic relationship with the EU. But on the whole, they'll get, we will have to recognize the asymmetry of that relationship. And that is very much written through this deal.
For those asking in terms of questions, use Super Chat and come in. You could come on through Facebook to YouTube. I know lots of people can asking, so that's how you do it. John, in terms of, perhaps, based on that, we might not like it. We didn't vote for it. But actually, 52% of the population did. They've got what they voted for.
Well, like I said, it depends on what you think they voted for. The promises made during the referendum were not about sort of mitigating damage. They're about increasing prosperity. Now, that demonstrably is not going to happen. So really, we needed to ask people what their priorities were. Was it more important to end free movement to people or to safeguard prosperity? That question was never asked, and we don't know the answer to it. We don't actually know, Owen, whether a majority of people even supported Brexit. Let's not forget that in the general election last year, 52%, again, dreaded ratio, of voters actually endorsed parties which either support a referendum or remain outright. So we just don't know if people wanted this outcome. And obviously, you can make the argument that Britain has got control of money, borders, laws, etc. I would make the argument that we already had control of those things. But we've never said that Britain couldn't do it. We just said that it would be immensely damaging to do so. And I still think that's true. Obviously, we have a deal. We're outside the single market custody, and the red lines have been met on both sides. No one's disputing that. I just think that the more important red line should have been about safeguarding Britain's economy, jobs, place in the world, and those things. And they've certainly been tossed aside.
On that, without again relitigating the past, it is true that 52% of people in the election voted for parties supporting Remain or another referendum, but millions of Remainers voted for the Conservatives, and there were leavers who voted.
We simply don't know because no one ever asked.
Of course, I mean there were some leavers who voted for the Scottish National Party. Roughly the same number of SNP voters in 2016 voted for leavers. Labour voters did, but anyway, let's not relitigate. In terms of who's given what, Jonathan, what do you think? In terms of, I mean, you said in terms of how asymmetrical the relationship is. Does this deal essentially reflect Britain versus a 27-member bloc with a much bigger economy and more people in it? I mean, is it basically a deal which reflects the balance of power, or is it a case of both sides have had to compromise and give a bit of ground?
I mean, I think that the point is that the starting point came from the balance of power, which is the EU said, you cannot be part of the single market or customs union or have the benefits of the single market or the customs union unless you're inside it. And we said, no, that's a red line for us because of freedom of movement. Therefore, we accept that we'll have to be outside it. The EU said that, and in that case, you can have a tariff-free deal on goods and agricultural products, where, of course, the EU has a very large surplus with us, but we will give you only relatively minor, comparable to what we do to other countries outside the single market on other things, like in particular services and financial services. And we said yes. So from the start, we accepted that we were given our red lines. We were going to do this deal on the EU's terms. We were going to look for a free trade deal for goods and not seek anything very much in terms of services. Then there have been, there are other areas in which there have been compromises on exactly how rules for state aid and the level playing field should work, on exactly what the terms would be on fish, and those have been basically about haggling. But yes, ultimately, this deal reflects the asymmetry of the economic relationship. I've always said that, that from the beginning of this, a reasonably good guide. It wasn't that, I think it was David Davis who said we hold all the cards. Which obviously was pure fantasy, but you also had some Remainers saying, no, the EU holds all the cards. And that's not true either. The simple fact is that the negotiating leverage is determined by the balance of power, which is roughly 80-20. They held roughly 80% of the cards, and that's roughly reflected in the deal we've got.
I mean, John, let's just, in terms of what strikes you, in terms of specific maybe pernicious aspects of the deal. It's also striking that Boris Johnson said there'll be no non-tariff barriers to trade. I'd like your reaction to that, but also any specific details of the agreement, which for you had particularly grind your gears.
Well, just comparing the press conferences between Ursula von der Leyen and Boris Johnson tells you what you need to know. Von der Leyen was clear and specific about what the EU had secured, and Johnson was bluster and BS. So when Harry Cole, I believe it was of all people, put it to him that we had been locked out of the EU security databases, he simply responded with some kind of pablum that everything would be all right with security. I mean, security is an incredibly important aspect of UK sort of security. Our EU cooperation is incredibly important for the running of the country, and it's extraordinary that a Conservative Prime Minister would be so dismissive on such an important plank of the running of the country. Obviously, services, as Jonathan said, 80% of our economy. Johnson conceded that we didn't get enough, as much access as we'd have wanted, and he sort of said something like, there's some good stuff on equivalence, which is kind of like something that you'd expect from someone who'd been winging an essay crisis or making it up as he went along. I mean, it's kind of, I suppose we'll come to Johnson's personality and how that kind of intersects with this nightmare later on, perhaps. But those are kind of the stick out points for me, that there was really no answer. It was all the usual guff cliches about taking back control, none of the actual substance, which people have a right to know. This is the most important economic change, well, obviously since 1973, but certainly the most deleterious change in a century. And Johnson had nothing to say about it apart from we'd won. I
mean, Jonathan, if we just bring in that point about the Prime Minister saying there'll be no non-tariff barriers to trade, which has caused quite a lot of consternation amongst certain Brexit watchers.
I'm astonished. I mean, not because Johnson said it, because we know he has a habit of simply making things up and saying them, but because it was actually apparently in his written speaking notes, which suggests that somebody within number 10, actually responsible for preparing what he was going to say, wrote it down, which is frankly an act of gross incompetence. We all know it's simply not true. There will be very significant new non-tariff barriers to UK trade, both in goods and services, from the 1st of January. And indeed, the government is spending literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds. I mean, you must all have seen the adverts and the pop-ups which tell you to get ready for Brexit, and what you need to do if you're a business to get ready for Brexit. Deal or no deal. They've been ubiquitous on the airwaves over the last couple of weeks. So if it was really true that there weren't going to be any neither tariffs nor non-tariff barriers, the government would be throwing a lot of money down the drain in telling business to do something which they didn't need to do. So it's obviously nonsense. I'm not sure I really have anything much more to say than that.
I mean, on the economic consequences, you've written a very detailed, you're one of the authors of a very detailed study about the likely economic consequences of this. Now, obviously, I mean, we need to demarcate a bit because we're going through the pandemic and the biggest peacetime crisis, I don't know when since. I studied history and I don't know when an equivalent peacetime crisis is on quite the scale. But so we need to disentangle that, and we'll talk about that going forward. But what's the net economic consequence on its own terms of this Brexit deal? Start again with you, Jonathan. I want to hear what John says as well.
I mean, I think the first thing to say is that there will be some disruption because of the new non-tariff barriers, which Johnson claims don't exist. There's likely to be a reasonable amount of disruption, in January at ports and so on. And as businesses simply don't know what's going on, that lots and lots of civil servants have been heroically working to put new systems in place. But frankly, they have not had the time. We all know what happens in the first few weeks of running new software, and business, of course, hasn't had the time to prepare. So there's bound to be some disruption. But what I would say is that, first of all, that disruption will probably not be catastrophic. Second, it will resolve itself over the next few months as people get to know the new systems. And third, it's probably not that important in economic terms. The fact that there are queues at ports and disruption and paperwork on day one doesn't mean Brexit is a failure. And the fact that after a while things will run smoothly doesn't mean it's a success either. It's the medium and long-term consequences that matter. So our estimates are that, and these are actually very similar to estimates produced by other independent economists and indeed by the government's own economists, are that over, say, the next 10 to 15 years, that Brexit will knock maybe 4, 5, or 6% off UK GDP. What that means is it will grow by about half a percentage point slower each year. It doesn't mean we'll get poorer. It just means the economy will grow slower than it otherwise would have. And that will feed through into wages, into productivity, into household incomes, and so on. As my colleague Anand said, it's more like it's not a blowout, it's a slow puncture. We won't notice it year by year, but over time we will sort of notice it because we'll start falling behind other countries. There's a lot of uncertainties here. So I sort of say, look, the best case is here that actually it doesn't really make much difference because other things matter more, and there are lots of other things going on. The worst case is that the UK begins to look a bit like Italy, not a poor country, not a country that's getting poorer, but a country that is because of its lack of dynamism economically, is just steadily falling bit by bit, a bit more behind its friends, competitors, and neighbours.
I mean, John, on one level, that sounds a bit depressing. But on another level, are people really going to notice, and are they going to really link it to Brexit? And I suppose on that, do you think the problem was, I mean, during the referendum campaign, the Remain side, well, the Tory element of it, George Osborne, I remember he went on to the Today programme, panicked when they'd clearly got internal polling showing that Leave was plausibly going to win. And he spoke about basically doing what was construed as a punishment budget if Britain voted to leave. That didn't happen, of course, when Britain did actually vote to leave. That all along, a lot of Remainers hyped up basically the economic consequences of Brexit to the degree where it was painted in pretty apocalyptic terms. And now that, I mean, based on what Jonathan Portes has said, that won't happen. I mean, we have our own economic problems now without Brexit, of course. It'd be hard to disentangle them. I mean, do you think that was a case of, was that an error, just focusing so much on a disastrous economic impact? I remember when people said, Jeremy Corbyn's plans, are all well and good, but he won't be able to implement them because the economic consequences of even a relatively soft Brexit will be so great, it will be impossible to do that. And at the time, I thought that bought into the logic of austerity or whatever. But I mean, what do you think? I mean, I've gone on there, but what, am I being harsh?
I think there are two things to disentangle. One is whether people actually believed what Osborne was saying about the economy, and two, whether people believed it and didn't mind it. Now, they're two quite different things. We know that a lot of Leavers simply didn't believe that we'd get poorer. They thought it was just Remain propaganda. Now, obviously there's a difference between getting poorer and getting less rich. But I think that the assumption was that we continue to be getting more prosperous, and that actually prosperity would rise. With what Leave was saying. So that's important. But of course, the other issue, as you completely rightly point out, the Remain campaign was a disaster, as we all know. I think most Remainers acknowledge that. There was far too much emphasis placed on sort of the economic fallout from Brexit, which was a kind of the Tories trying to replay the 2015 election campaign, where Ed Miliband had seemed to lose because Labour seemed to spend too much, and people worried about the economic impact of Labour getting in, and so that's kind of, obviously we should have had a different campaign, which should have extolled the benefits of being in the EU, not just for the economy, but also in terms of our society, culture. The news that we've left Erasmus, for example, huge blow to people. For decades, that has allowed people in Britain and people in the EU to kind of explore different cultures, learn different languages, meet new people, have different horizons. And that's why free movement of people has always been kind of conceived of as this kind of imposition on us, when actually it was a huge opportunity that too many of us didn't make use of, and that people should have been encouraged to make use of. And it's this kind of closing in, which I think is the longest term effect, if you like, this kind of smallness of Britain, that we kind of, this global Britain thing has always been alive. We've always been global. And let's not forget, the EU did not put us in a cage. It wasn't the EU did not stop us invading Iraq, for heaven's sake. We can be as global for good or ill as we want to be. But the EU allowed us to kind of exert that global influence, if you like, again, for good or ill, I think often for good, actually. And now we kind of close in on ourselves. We kind of imprisoned ourselves in this island. And I think we might even see that quite literally from the 1st of January, if the UK is included, doesn't have the exemption of being able to travel into the EU because of COVID rules. I think this is kind of like the longer term impact. People may notice the economic effects, they may not, but I don't think it's the only thing we have to think about.
Jonathan, the big thing which drove or made the hearts beat a bit faster for a lot of Tory Brexiteers was that it would open up the ability for the government to be able to strip away various regulations, others would call them rights, protections for workers, consumers, environmental protections, and all the rest of it. I mean, that was what Brexit was for them. It was basically to, red tape, get rid of all that from Brussels. And what Thatcher famously in her Bruges speech in 1988, where she kicked off modern right-wing Euroscepticism by saying that we haven't driven back the frontiers of the state only to have them reimposed at European level. To what extent has that been made possible? Because of this level playing field agreement in which every few years the EU will be able to basically review whether or not Britain is sticking by it, and therefore undermining undercutting competition. So have they lost that? That was a big thing for them. Is that not now going to happen?
I mean, I think, what some of them will say is, well, we have the right to do it, and we've got the level playing field provisions in the in this deal which enable us to do that, and the EU can only punish us under certain circumstances. But I think it goes back to what I was saying before about the asymmetry of the Canada-US relationship. Yes. So the UK now has the technical right to, say, repeal the Working Time Directive, a famous hate figure, a bugbear of some extreme Eurosceptics on the Tory right. Do we think that the UK will use that? I think it's pretty unlikely. There's no lobby for it from business. Actually, the CBI didn't like it at the time, but they're pretty much reconciled to the way it works. Is any UK government in the future going to go against business and the trade unions and what the public overwhelmingly thinks and try and reduce workers' rights in a meaningful way, even leaving aside the potential that will disrupt UK-EU trade? I think it's pretty unlikely. I've always thought this idea that that the UK was somehow going to be Singapore on Thames in both Philip Hammond and Mrs. Merkel's phrase. It's a fantasy, really, because actually the political constituency for that doesn't exist here. And ultimately, I don't think, that, as I say, the combination of domestic political forces and the asymmetry of the UK-EU relationship means that in practice, we're not very likely to diverge very significantly on those things.
John, freedom of movement, of course, ends. And it is true that a lot of people did vote for Brexit purely because of that. Oh, that was the big thing. I grew up in a Stockport, a northern town, which voted to remain, but my ward voted to leave. Very few migrants in my ward. But undoubtedly, a lot of people who did vote for leave amongst the community in which I grew up in blamed, I would say completely wrongly, problems caused by the powerful, failure to invest in public services, failure to protect skilled, well-paid jobs, whether it be the housing crisis, that these failures were blamed on migrants wrongly. And there wasn't a narrative that was strong enough for years before that to push back on that. But nonetheless, that's what they voted for. What do you think will happen? I mean, because freedom of movement will end. Do you think that issue now, I mean, because actually, if you look at polling, immigration, people's attitudes have actually improved since the referendum. It's quite interesting. But what do you think the economic, human consequences of this will be? You've already mentioned Erasmus, but more broadly.
I think it's part of the same issue, isn't it? Part of the beauty of free movement of people was that it allowed people rights, not just, maybe a possibility of doing something, but a fundamental right. That it was our right to go to 27 other countries and to make a new life there, to retire there, to find work there, to find love there, whatever it might be, and to allow other people to do the same here. Now that, for me, is the story of humanity. The story of humanity is one of migration. It's one of people finding a new life or having the opportunity to find a new life in a place where they were not born. Now, often that has obviously been done through hardship or needs or war or really unpleasant things. But it's also a story of aspiration, and that should be celebrated by the left. And too many, I think, on the left were saying that it was somehow racist that the EU was granting those opportunities just to itself. I think that's completely wrong. Partly because the EU is a club. And in a club, you have certain rights and responsibilities within that club. But also, there is nothing to stop, and never has been anything to stop, the UK from expanding that right to wherever in the world it wants to. The UK has always been at liberty to grant free movement to the entire world. So that's why I found it so unpleasant and dishonest. The campaign in 2016 by some on the right, particularly Priti Patel, with the Save Our Curry movement, suggests that Brexit would allow more Bangladeshi curry chefs, for example, to come in because we weren't going to have so many Europeans coming in. There was nothing to stop the UK government to allow any number of Bangladeshi chefs in, and it was her own government under David Cameron which had increased restrictions on them to begin with. So I kind of felt that sort of playing people off against each other was also incredibly unpleasant and dishonest. And I will be campaigning for migration rights for as long as I live, because I think it's an untrammeled good.
Yeah. Yeah, Jonathan, just in terms of the last part, we're looking forward.
Yeah.
In terms of looking forward, what do you think? How can that debate be shaped on the rights of migrants and immigration in this new context?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with both of you about free movement and about the scapegoating of immigration for things which were fundamentally driven by austerity. But I mean, I think John made an important point there, that free movement was not racist or discriminatory in a context of a situation where we were a member of the EU. But it clearly would be, in my view, discriminatory and in fact, in practice, racist, were we to give a substantial degree of European preference to EU countries now that we're outside the EU. So we have to make the best of the situation we have. And there, I think I'm somewhat more optimistic than John is when he talked about how, you know, the UK was likely to turn inwards, become less global rather than more. That might happen, but it is not by any means necessary. As you said, Owen, public opinion has shifted pretty radically. Public opinion doesn't want free movement back, but is much more positive about immigration in general on both economic and cultural grounds than it was 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And there's been this big, profound and persistent shift in the positive direction. So if that can be translated into policy, then the UK can, it will be a different sort of openness, and we may all regret the loss of free movement, both personally and for other reasons. But that doesn't mean the UK needs to become a closed country. And, you know, it is potentially, we don't know because it may not be that important, but potentially one of the most important decisions taken by a British government in this field for very many years, probably since 2004, was the one by this government to give essentially to offer settlement here and ultimately citizenship to holders of British national overseas citizen passports in Hong Kong and their dependents. Now, that might amount only to a few tens of thousands of people. It might, depending on what happens in China and Hong Kong, amount to hundreds of thousands of people. If that is the case, and it is a big if it is hundreds of thousands, that will have a profound economic and social impact on this country over the next few years, and in my view, almost certainly for the better. But you know that so there are reasons for optimism as well as pessimism.
I mean, in terms of, optimism is always good because we're in the middle, I'm sure you both noticed, of a pandemic, which has brought the country to its knees. So just before I bring John in again, Jonathan, I mean, in terms of economically, how do you think this is all going to interact? Because next year, what we've had this year is obviously mass death. Tens of thousands of people died. We're looking at a resurgence, partly winter, partly because of a deadlier strain, the government's catastrophic handling of the whole thing. What do you think we'll see economically coming into next year?
I mean, I actually think that we're likely to see a pretty big bounce, possibly even a mini boom in the as we come out of this. One of the dreadful, as you say, the mishandling of the timing of restrictions combined with the introduction of a vaccine means, in a sense, we are, everything is now going to happen very quickly. We have this hugely accelerating pandemic now, which is terrible in human terms. But that means, first of all, things will happen, it is rushing through the population faster, and it means that we will have to accelerate the rollout of the vaccine as quickly as possible to get it over with as quickly as possible before more people die. But I think the end result will be that one way or the other, this will all end relatively quickly next year. And then actually, I think economically, we will see quite a sharp bounce because it is a fact. This is, a lot of people don't like to hear this because either because they personally are suffering economically or because they don't want to feel guilty. But the fact is that a lot of people, in purely economic terms, will come out of this looking quite good with large amounts of money in their bank accounts. People like me, and possibly the two of you, who can work remotely, who are not constrained, who don't work in face-to-face customer service sectors, we're getting our salaries and we haven't been able to spend them. So the result is there's a huge amount of, in that half of the population that's done quite well, there's a lot of unspent money, and that, you know, people will want to spend money on consumer goods, on holidays, and all the rest of it. I think the potential for a quite strong consumer-led recovery in the first half of next year is actually there. At the same time, of course, it will be a very unequal recovery, because for a lot of people, they have either lost their job or their job won't come back, or won't come back in the same form. So a lot of people will still be suffering. But overall, I think the economy may do surprisingly well.
I mean, John, how do you think, in terms of the crisis that we're currently in, that will interact with Brexit? And how do you see that shaping? The next election, of course, is likely to be 2024. What do you think? How do you see this panning out politically?
I mean, you'd be a fool to make predictions about the next 4 years, wouldn't you? You've seen what's happened in the last year, the last 5 years. I agree with Jonathan that the next year is going to see an improvement. Obviously, we hope that people will be vaccinated and that things might begin to return to normal towards the middle of the year. But in terms of, this is a profoundly traumatic event that's happened, and so we just don't know about the long-term effects. As we following this huge economic shock could be a sustained period of austerity, which will obviously interact with Brexit, because, like it or not, there are going to be fewer opportunities. A lot of jobs will be lost in supply chains, because we are, as we've established, we're going to have a lot of non-tariff barriers, even though we've got zero tariff trade. And so I think that and also there are going to be a lot of companies that simply don't feel confident in investing in Britain anymore. And so a lot of that will depend on how Rishi Sunak, or whoever the Chancellor is, if Rishi Sunak becomes Prime Minister, how he kind of manages the situation, how well Labour is able to mount an effective response to any kind of new austerity. But we know that the good times are not coming back anytime soon in terms of the economy. And so, Labour needs to spell out an alternative vision, and also to spell out how it would do things differently. But I think that, any idea that Brexit is going to be irrelevant, I think is misguided, because there are all kinds of things which will emerge as a result of Brexit. Some will be short term, some will be long term, but it's absolutely, certainly for Remainers like me, who ideally would want to rejoin one day, it's important to kind of differentiate between what is because of COVID and what's because of the EU, and kind of to begin arguing at some point, not in the immediate future, but how we can actually, our economic national best interests are served by being much closer to the EU in terms of harmonisation, even if we don't actually rejoin it.
I mean, Jonathan, we're coming towards the end, but what do you think Labour's economic agenda should be in this context, post-Brexit, post-pandemic? I mean, it's interesting. Rishi Sunak, of course, I would say, actually, I wrote a column last week about one of the main architects of our current calamitous state. He pushed hard behind the scenes to stop restrictive lockdown measures on economic grounds. He brought in the academics who buck the consensus on coronavirus, which is like bringing in climate change deniers to inform environmental policy. He obviously brought in things like Eat Out to Help Out, and spread the virus. Who would have thought putting lots of people in indoor confined areas with a highly infectious virus would help do exactly that? But he is extremely popular in the government. He's very, very popular with the country, the electorate. And at the moment, Labour's not really there in the economic question. So what do you think in terms of what they should be saying in this new climate, especially if there is this bounce?
I think, first of all, as I said, I would expect a bounce, but also it won't last that long. The economy over the next 3 or 4 years will continue to be hobbled by Brexit and other structural problems. That's the first point. The second point I would say is that, as I said, this recovery will be very much a an unequal one, and it will not be a recovery in which we are all in it together by any means. Those who have suffered most during the pandemic will not see the fruits of the recovery. So emphasizing that and trying to set out what a genuine leveling up agenda might look like, that is not just about dealing out pots of money essentially to via Tory MPs to beautify high streets. But what would a genuine leveling up agenda that looked not just at the red wall seats of the north, but actually across the country at disadvantaged groups and communities in everywhere from East London to East Kilbride? What would that actually look like? What would it mean in terms of trying to transfer wealth and power? What would real devolution and giving back powers to the regions look like? That's one aspect of it, and the other, I think, is about some of the future challenges for the economy, and particularly moving to net zero. I think we, and that includes me, just haven't really got our heads around just what a sort of profound change that means for the British economy, arguably much bigger than Brexit, actually, in some ways. And how you actually do that, and the extension of state control and regulation and state interaction with the private sector that is going to be required if you're going to achieve that in an efficient and effective way.
Just finally, and thanks Simon and Honoré for the super sticker support. John, just very pithily, Labour are going to support this deal. They've made that abundantly clear. If they didn't vote for the deal, it would still go through. So it's not like they're doing it to stop no deal. They're doing it to win back Leave support. And that is the calculation fundamentally that Jamie Corbyn made when he was resistant about moving to a second referendum. I'm just interested finally on your thoughts on that and where Labour are going. And we need to wrap this up very soon, but go for it.
Well, as you know, I was actually one of the few defenders of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour policy for a long time. I thought that he, for the most part, struck the right balance, and then obviously he went wrong because he didn't embrace the second referendum soon enough. But you and I agree that second referendum policy had to happen, otherwise Labour would have hemorrhaged Remain votes as well as Leave ones, and Leave votes had already left it. On Keir Starmer, I've been really disappointed by his position. I think that he could have advocated much more strongly for a close relationship. When he said on Monday that he wouldn't support an extension to the transition period, that was incredibly disappointing as well, because we have a new COVID strain, the borders are being closed off. We'll have 3 days of an implementation period, which is meant to be 21 months, for heaven's sake. So business is not ready for this deal, come what may. And so it was really important for him to, I think, to emphasize that a deal was important and to actually put the national interest ahead of party interests. I'm afraid that he hasn't done that. And I understand why he wants to vote for the deal. When Labour abstains, people accused of sitting on the fence or having a position. But the real risk is that he won't allow Boris Johnson to own this deal. This will be a Labour deal as well. And when the consequence of this deal become apparent, which I think they will, and we're looking back on this moment, it will be seen as a huge error that Labour backed this economically damaging deal when they could have abstained on it and explained why.
You've both been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Really insightful and incisive. Very, very thoughtful, very nuanced. So thank you so much, particularly on Christmas Eve. I know you probably had some grand Christmas Eve plans, some restaurant you were going to eat at, but it was a real honor. Thank you so much. And I know lots of people have been bombarded with people saying just how brilliant those contributions were. So thank you very much, and happy Christmas to you both.
Happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas.
See you both soon. Wow, that was great. That was really, really good. I learned a lot from that. Rocky times ahead, to say the least. It's going to be a turbulent year. Now, just before I finish, actually, this Sunday, I'd normally do a Sunday show, but it is Christmas. We've done another one, a very special one here because of Brexit. So what I'm doing instead is a special live charity thing, 1 o'clock onwards. I'll be having a few drinks, which could descend downhill. But it's to raise money for Campaign Against Living Miserably, which is a charity which fight against male suicide, which is the biggest killer of men under 45, and mental distress obviously has got worse during very difficult times. So we've got some amazing guests. We've got people like Nish Kumar, Professor Green, comedians like Mark Watson. We've got Courtney Shane, who is the genius behind Courtney Act. And I'll be co-presenting with Ellie Mohagan, my friend and compañero. But it'll be 1 o'clock onwards. So go to my YouTube channel and you'll see it on the main page. Click to set a reminder. Tell everyone, because we're raising money for what I think is a very important cause that I'm very passionate about. Also, on Patreon/OwenJones84, you can support this, whatever you want to give, so that we can keep expanding, do more and more shows, more documentaries, more interviews. And as I said, we've got Michael Sheen coming up. We've got Judith Butler, who's a brilliant feminist philosopher. We've got great documentaries coming up in the new year as well. We're going to work around the regulations and make them happen. But thank you for your support. You've been absolutely brilliant. And I hope this channel's only been up for about a month and a half. But it's been pretty good, I would say. Thanks to you. And thanks to the people we've been able to speak to. And next year's we're just gonna go from strength to strength. That's the plan. If you want more analysis about Brexit stuff, go over to our friends at Navara Media. They're now live, talking over the deal as well. I mean, you've got very little else to do, I'm afraid, unless you're in Hereford, which I think is still under tier 1 until Boxing Day. It must be like Weimar, Berlin. But enjoy yourselves. It's been a massive, massive pleasure. It's been a difficult year, but we've got loads coming up, including before the end of the year, a documentary of a polemic, which will go through every stage of what the government messed up. It's a very long list, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But but for today, happy Christmas, and I will see you on Sunday. Don't forget, 1 p.m, set a reminder. Happy Christmas, and lots of love.